right, welcome back. Our second session of the morning focuses on Florida's indigenous peoples. I'll introduce the speakers just prior to their individual talks. First up, Dr. Denise Bossy is the Alan Lastinger Term Professor of Florida History at the University of North Florida. Her teaching and research focus on Florida, local indigenous history, public and digital humanities, and the Native South. Her award-winning publications include The Yamasee Indians from Florida to South Carolina, which came out in 2018, her forthcoming book, Yamasee, Indigenous Mobility and Power in the Early South, will be published by the University of North Carolina Press. I'm looking forward immensely to that coming out. I bet she is as well. Her paper this morning is titled Bartram as a Window into Indigenous Florida. Welcome, Dr. Bossy.
I want to thank Catherine especially for inviting me to speak today. It's just a wonderful opportunity for me to share with you some of the ongoing research that I'm involved in, and to really do it through the lens of Bartram is particularly exciting. And I should start by saying I'm at the University of North Florida, which is a short 50-minute drive from here in Jacksonville. And I've been teaching there for about 17 years. And Bartram has become part of my teaching curriculum too. So I want to start today with a land acknowledgement, and I've put two different pieces up here to sort of center us. One is a map of indigenous Northeast Florida around, the 16th century. The other is a more contemporary art piece that talks about the land that calls indigenous people home who've been forcibly removed from these spaces, and that's who I'm going to be talking about today. So I want to acknowledge that this land that we're in right now is the unceded territory of Timucua speakers, including at points the Mocama polity, which stretched all the way from southeastern coastal Georgia, at times into as far as St. Augustine. For thousands of years, indigenous people made this space into their homelands. They curated and landscaped and shaped the spaces that Bartram would later travel through. Very intentionally, very strategically. They also had deep religious ties to these homelands. This was a world that was profoundly connected, an indigenous world marked by roads. So for example, when we talk about the British moving in and constructing roads, in fact, what they're doing is overlaying indigenous roads and pathways and waterways that have been here and nurtured and constructed and designed by brilliant indigenous people for thousands of years before Bartram or any colonist stepped foot in this land. And when I say unceded, that's because these lands were ripped away, stolen, thieved. Indigenous people were enslaved throughout Florida through different forms of labor systems. And so the violence that undergirds a lot of what Bartram is talking about is both violence against enslaved Africans and also against free and enslaved indigenous people. And it's important to acknowledge all of that. So I want to start today by tackling a myth that still belabors a lot of our scholarship. And that is this myth of Florida as really a widowed land in terms of its indigenous populations, especially sort of between 1710s and into the British period, as many scholars call it, so into the late 18th century. Prior to this, really beginning in 1691, there's a period of incredible violence that swept across much of indigenous Northeast Florida as the British, coming out of South Carolina, partnered with Yamasees, Muskogees, and others to enslave indigenous Floridians and to funnel them into the Atlantic slave system. They enslaved an estimated 30,000 native people from Florida, mostly from northern Florida, sweeping from the coast into present-day Appalachia, into Appalachia, which is really present-day Tallahassee region. What's fascinating about this is that indigenous people, especially the Yamasees and the Apalachicolas, who would become known as the Lower Creeks or Muskogees, collaborated in this to establish themselves as really the dominant force in this region. And that's important to understanding what happens later. By 1706, the British, in collusion with Yamasees and Muskogee speakers, had effectively destroyed what the Spanish thought of as their mission system, and were slaving as far south as current-day South Florida into the Keys. By 1711, that violence had largely come to a fold because the Calusas had really pushed the Yamasees out of South Florida, really promoting a very, or articulating a very strong stance against slaving and against their intrusions into their area. Now, following on this, scholars assumed that there were no indigenous people really left anywhere in Florida. That there were pockets of so-called remnants. And we've lived with this legacy for a very long time. This is a map from 1711 from Thomas Nairn, who was a South Carolina colonial trader, settler, and Indian agent at different points to the Yamasees. And he accompanied the Yamasees on one of their expeditions into South Florida, into Calusa territory. And you can see here him saying there are no inhabitants, essentially from present-day Tallahassee, Appalachia region, all the way to the south of Florida. And so the British began to propagate very early this myth. And unfortunately, many scholars have picked up this myth for generations. And this is changing now, which is really important. So, for example, one of these myths has been propagated by Hoffman, whose wonderful Florida's Frontiers has otherwise, really big issue, which is that he listens to colonial sources that themselves are very limited and says things like, beyond St. Augustine and its tiny security zone, the peninsula lay open and largely unoccupied, save for camps of occasional creek raiding or hunting parties. And here he's really talking about St. Augustine in the 1740s and 1750s, kind of on the eve of the transfer between the Spanish and British over control of East and what will be called West Florida. The problem with this mythology is that it has bigger implications. So there's this initial mythology that Florida is a widowed land, but onto it becomes layered this second mythology that the only indigenous people really left in Florida are Creeks, or Muskogees as they call themselves today, who began to migrate into the region in the 1710s as hunters. This is part of the mythology, and then established overnight camps and then longer and longer settlements and began to repopulate this supposedly widowed land. And this has also led to a notion of our two federally recognized nations today, the Seminole tribe and the Miccosukee tribe, of them as simply ancestors or descendants of these Muskogee, wanderers who came into the area. And here I have a site from the website from the Department of State talking about this, kind of laying out this history of the Seminoles as ancestors of simply the Creeks who moved into the area in the 19th century especially, but beginning in the early 18th century. This is not at all how Seminoles and Miccosukees today talk about their ancestors. This is in complete contrast to how they understand their origins and their deep connection to Florida. And so here are the Seminoles presenting a little snippet of that history, presenting themselves as, in fact, the descendants of ancient Floridians as well as Muskogee Creeks. And it's important to listen to indigenous people when they talk about their history. And that's something that Bartram understood. Bartram listened to indigenous people. His informants were indigenous people. And when they spoke to him about their history, he didn't say, because you keep your history in oral terms, because you don't write it down, I'm not going to pay attention. Quite the contrary, he listened astutely and sensitively to what indigenous people told him about their own past, something that scholars are finally beginning to do today, but for a very long time have not. And so, here is Bartram in contrast to Nairn, that map that we saw, saying, in fact, this whole area is populated, right? Not beyond St. Augustine and its tiny security zone is the peninsula open, but instead, this is populated by Timucuas, Utina Timucuas, another component of the Timucua. Also by Calusas, by Yamasees, and other, he calls them remnant tribes, because he doesn't really understand what's happening in this world, but he's listening to them and observing and hearing them talk about who they are. And so I want to encourage us to think about that as we embark on sort of a quick and dirty history of indigenous Florida in the 18th century. So Bartram offers us this window, but we can explode it a bit through a variety of different kinds of sources, archaeological, historical, and oral history too. And what we find is that there's a great deal of indigenous survivance in the 18th century in Florida. That the Yamasees do not go extinct, as scholars have long claimed, that the Timucuas do not go extinct, that the Appalachians do not go extinct. They don't just disperse and leave the territory, but that many instead stay. And they create a patchwork of indigenous sovereignty across Florida They are mostly living in town communities, which is really the core component of most native Southerner nations in this period. They're all comprised of towns, which themselves are collections of families run by women. They are matrilineal towns who comprise then sometimes bigger organizations if they have coalitions or alliances with other towns. That's really how the Creek or Muskogee Nation came to be. It was a world of towns that decided to confederate. And they began to confederate really in the late 17th century, and over the course of the following 50, 60, 70 years created a nation, but it took a long time. So Florida, too, in this period is a town, a world of indigenous towns, connected, populated, and not by any means a widowed land. And this flies in the face, especially of what the British were attempting to do when they took over Florida in the 1760s, was define, conquer, and describe this land in order to turn it into a plantation enterprise. And part of doing that meant trying to survey, and part of doing that also meant trying to undermine indigenous survivance in the area. So here we have a general map of the southern British colonies in America compiled by de Bram, and other surveyors, and put together by Romans in 1776. And although he describes much of the South as still populated by indigenous nations, especially the Muskogee Nation, he also describes Florida at the same time as really empty, a place that has a history of sort of loss when it comes to indigenous people. So across the map are written things like, here's the ancient country of the Timucuas, a tribe of the old Appalachians. And here, right, reveals the limits of British knowledge. In fact, the Timucuas are many nations who speak a separate language, a Timucua language, whereas the Appalachians live in a completely different part of Florida and speak a totally unrelated language. So there's a basic element of knowledge that's really missing. Other things say, this is a great swamp whose highland is inhabited by an Appalachian tribe who keep the avenue secret. And so there are already these rumors among the British of indigenous people living beyond their knowledge, living in places they don't access, because the British themselves are solely confined to really St. Augustine at this stage, a very small, outpost. There are other things that say remnants of the Appalachians are here, or this is now an uninhabited space. And again, this flies in the face of what we now can reconstruct, which is that Yamasees, Mocamas, and other Timucua speakers, Guales, Appalachians, Calusas, Ais, Tocobagos, and Tequestas, and others continued to survive throughout the 18th century and to live in Florida as well as other places. So I want to now focus us on one of these indigenous nations, and that's the Yamasees. And I'm going to take us sort of briefly through their history so that you understand how Florida fits into their world, and how looking at them and looking at their transformation of different places in Florida into their homelands and their survivance really reveals a great deal about how indigenous nations more generally survived in the second half of the 18th century in Florida. Who here has heard of the Yamasee? Oh, that's really good. So that's more than normal. A lot of my students have never heard the nation and didn't know that they were in Florida at all. The Yamasee really are descendants of two core groups of people who were shattered to some extent by colonization, especially by the advent of indigenous enslavement, first in Virginia and then South Carolina. So early Virginians enslaved indigenous people alongside Africans, early South Carolinians enslaved indigenous people alongside Africans, and in fact, at main points, it was easier for them to enslave indigenous people who were right in their backyard than to import Africans to persuade the ships carrying enslaved people across the Atlantic into what were backwater colonies at their start. South Carolina in particular wouldn't have survived economically if they had not engaged in this horrific enslavement of tens of thousands of indigenous people. It supported their economy. And again, the main target was Florida. So beginning in the 1650s, as the Virginians begin to slave into central Georgia, the main ancestors of the Yamasees fight for their homelands for years and then ultimately decide to disperse. They are the people of chiefdoms that Hernando de Soto met when he went through in the 1540s, actually in 1540, of Okute, of Echizi, of Altamaha, and others like Kofaki, these big chiefdoms who actually managed and maneuvered Soto peacefully through their communities and directed him to their enemies, the Kofita Chekis. Very nimble, very powerful, very savvy indigenous nations. they're wrecked by slaving, and they disperse in a lot of different regions. They become diasporic. And one group moves down the Savannah River, where they establish themselves for the first time as the Yamasee. It's a name that recalls their ancestors. At its root, it's part of Altamaha. It's an homage to the Altamaha matrilineage from which they descend. They then move in the early 1660s into Walimocama, into what the Spanish think of as La Florida, but which indigenous people very much do not think of as La Florida, and still maintain their territorial control in places like Wale and Mocama. They live in Florida for about 20 years, and I'm going to come back to that. One of the things to note about the Yamasees is how highly mobile they were. So they were not mobile ancestrally, but their ancestors had used mobility to recreate their world over and over again within their region, and had really fine-tuned notions of how to make place, of how to mobilize their communities, and of how to govern themselves. And the Yamasees took all of these tools in response to colonialism and the advent especially of slaving to develop what was the most highly mobile indigenous nation in the South for their time. And this is a brief list of all of their different homelands on a map that I've been able to reconstruct over a decade of research. And this is why most people don't study the Yamasees, because this is painstaking work that requires you to go across archives and into archaeology, and really nobody should ever have done this, but I did. So now I have to finish it. And you can see it includes Florida at different points too. Now, their mobility doesn't mean that they didn't have a sense of place, or that they didn't understand themselves as connected and rooted, or as we would think of it, as owning territory. They did. They didn't commodify land, but they did have profound attachments to homelands even once they left them. And there are a couple of reasons for that. Most obviously because they buried their ancestors in those spaces. And the Yamasees understood themselves as living in a world that was multi-tiered, where they remained connected to their ancestors as well as to the upper and lower worlds and this world in which they lived. So they marked their spaces and returned to those spaces to revisit their ancestors. They also returned to visit to harvest their crops, not because they needed food, but instead because they were profoundly attached to place through food, especially through corn, which is at the heart of one of the most sacred ceremonies still for Indigenous Southerners today, the green corn ceremony, or the busk, as it's called. So they were mobile, but also deeply invested in place, and Yamasee women in particular were the heart of Yamasee mobility because they were the heads of their households. These were matrilineal communities, and they recreated space every time they moved. Every time they moved, they rapidly recreated their communities. They built new roads or expanded prior indigenous roads. They built their homelands, council houses, homesteads, farms, agriculture that were immediately productive, usually within a year. Remarkable. And this was a direct response to colonialism, that they would pick up and move, not without forethought, not with flight or refugeeism solely in their mind, but to identify new powerful places where they could protect their sovereignty. And this is where Florida fits into their world. They moved into Florida first in the 1660s, lived here for 20 years, established this remarkable spread out, what I call dispersed nation, anchored by settlements in Walimocama in sort of southeastern Georgia, northeastern Florida on the coast, right near us. They also established a settlement in Appalachia. They established a settlement in Apalachicola, or Lower Creek Muskogee community. And then they also established very briefly, but were interrupted in this establishment, a fourth anchor in Timucua territory, right near us in St. Augustine today. They lived here for 20 years and then moved for a variety of reasons to create a new homeland in South Carolina. Bartram offers us, did I do the second one? No. They come back to Florida in 1715 after catalyzing what is the largest pan-Indigenous or international Indigenous war in the history of the South. In 1715, the Yamasees, with many of their allies, especially their Muskogee allies, their Creek allies, but also with many other indigenous communities across sort of the greater South Carolina, Georgia area, wage a war against South Carolina aimed at bringing the Indian slave trade to an end, which they succeed in. In the course of that, however, the Yamasee lose their homelands in South Carolina, are driven out. And for the next several decades, colonial settlers in South Carolina lead a direct assault on their homelands. And the Yamasees return in kind by going into those spaces and trying to recover them and to destabilize plantation slavery in South Carolina, especially by liberating and helping in the liberation of enslaved Africans and Indians on those plantations. This is the context in which they returned to Florida and once again create a dispersed nation across Florida. They settle in St. Augustine. They settle in Old Appalachia, where they actually try to revive their entire nation at one point in the 1720s. They settle in other parts of West Florida, and they create this very spread out nation that continues to survive really in diaspora. And this is where we re-enter with Bartram. When Bartram was describing the way in which the 1740s and 1750s Florida was not empty or widowed, he was also describing the battle that was really beginning to heat up over Florida territories between indigenous people and then increasingly between the British as they come in the 1760s. And so you can see this with this second part of his quote. And so he's talking here about the establishment of one outlying Muskogee settlement that James is going to talk a lot probably about after me, by Cowkeeper or Ahaya, who guided the Oconees, who are Muskogees, to first an island off the coast of Georgia and then into present-day Gainesville area, into Alachua, to try to create a new community. And as he did this, as Cowkeeper led somewhat like 130 men with their families to settle in northern Florida, he realized that he was not alone, that he was trying to settle in lands that were already owned by indigenous people, right? Not commodified, but deeply and profoundly their homelands. And he was attacked repeatedly. And so there is actually a battle that many scholars don't talk about, which is really about persistent indigenous sovereignty in Florida. And we can see this in other maps, in other documents. So here's Joseph Purcell, who came into the region precisely to map a road across much of where the Yamasees and other indigenous Floridians still lived. And what he found was a lot more than he documented. And he tells us this. He admits to us the limits of British colonial records. And that's what's fascinating about the Purcell map. He identifies 6 towns by name that he calls Seminole. And among them is at least one Yamasee town, Tomatley, which is an old Yamasee name revived once again and kept. And we'll see this throughout, from the 16th to the 19th centuries, Tomatley town. And he admits there are other places he just didn't go. There are other indigenous towns he just didn't go to. And some he also didn't record because they seemed too small to him to be worthy of attention. Again, this is a world comprised of small towns. And Purcell is telling us, I don't pay attention to what's happening there. So there's an unexamined war for Florida that I want to talk just a little bit about, and that Bartram offers us a window into. And this unexamined war is really being led by the Muskogees and indigenous Floridians who are already here, like the Yamasee especially, and also becomes increasingly a war too with the British. And Bartram is aware of this. And when he visits Alachua in particular and meets with Cowkeeper or Migo Ahaya, he's very aware of this war, and Ahaya, in fact, is signaling his right to Florida, and he articulates it through the notion that he has conquered the Yamasee. And this is a theme that we're going to see throughout the late 18th century into the 19th and even 20th centuries, that both the British and then Anglo-Americans on the one side and Muskogee Creeks articulate their right to own Florida by virtue of having conquered the Yamasee who had those dispersed nations across Florida who are very powerful militarily for a point in the South, one of the most powerful military nations in the South. So they repeatedly do this. And when he meets Ahaya, Bartram discovers that he has Yamasee slaves. And those slaves aren't enslaved to work on plantations. They are not. In fact, he remarks they're dressed better than Ahaya. They're political slaves. They signify the conquering of the Yamasees. Ahaya had probably taken these Yamasees in the 1740s when he fought alongside General Oglethorpe, who invaded from Georgia, St. Augustine. That's probably how long he's had them by that point. So Ahaya not only has Yamasees as captives, but also enacts in a really remarkable way his feigned conquest of the Yamasees for a British audience. In 1771, Ahaya assaults New Smyrna, which we've talked a little bit about already today, which is run by Dr. Andrew Turnbull. And his claim for attacking New Smyrna is that he has heard that he has good information, there's a Yamasee and Spanish settlement to the south in the Mosquito area. And he's headed there to conquer them, right? He is the conqueror of the Yamasee. That is part of the foundation for his right to control Florida. In fact, what he does is he uses this to leverage tribute from Turnbull. Turnbull, to get Ahaya out of his lands, has to give him liquor, a calf, and food. And this isn't the only time that Ahaya or other Muskogee leaders who are trying to establish control over Florida do this. They do this in other places where they extort essentially tribute from the British, going to forts and demanding payment for the borrowing of their land. That's how they articulate it. When the Spanish handed over St. Augustine to the British, Ahaya said, "What have you done? This is our land. The Spanish were just borrowing it from us, and now it belongs to us once again." So they're very different notions of what these treaties really mean. And again, it's really interesting because it becomes all tied back to the Yamasee. So these myths of Yamasee conquest continue throughout the 19th century, even as the British begin to take over Florida, as it shifts into American territory. These myths of Yamasee conquest continue to be articulated by both British and Anglo-Americans, and then also by Muskogee Creeks, as a way to articulate that they own this territory. And we can see this in all sorts of different ways. And so, again, we return to Bartram, who says, with regard to the Muskogees, the first object in order to attain these territories was essentially to conquer the Yamasee. And we see it also in William Simmons when he's trying to find a new site for the first capital for what is now an American territory, and he ultimately settles on Tallahassee. As he travels through this, he too relates that the Seminoles have the right of land in Florida because they've conquered the Yamasee. He's followed a year later by Captain Horatio Dexter, who says not only that, but Ahaya's own son married a Yamasee woman. And so ties into this notion that the Seminoles have actually conquered the Yamasee and integrated their women, their matriarchs, into their communities, and this gives them control over Florida. We see this too arise in a lot of Southern literature. In 1835, William Gilmore Simms publishes The Yamasee, A Last Romance. And he's doing this very much in the vein of James Fenimore Cooper's Last of the Mohicans. A year after Cooper publishes his Last of the Mohicans, Simms publishes a poem first that's called The Last of the Yamasee, where he sort of bemoans their passing. And he expands this into a novel where he depicts the Yamasee as a sort of a noble, powerful race who can no longer exist in what has become a white and black South. There is no future for them, sadly. They cannot exist in modernity, but their power and their territorial hold over Florida are really what are at the heart of American conquest of Florida, he argues. And we see this too, in like the Florida Herald publishes this remarkable story about the last two Yamasee. It's a very Adam and Eve, a woman and man who survive on an island, and they're just remnants of this powerful indigenous past that has now become part of American history. We see it too into the late 19th, early 20th centuries among the Muskogees. There's a Miko Espehechar, who is a really important religious leader for the Muskogee Nation and delivers several different versions of a Yamasee conquest that all come back to the Muskogee Nation owning Florida. So they become really this core about territoriality. So I want to come back as I conclude just to the idea that Bartram introduces us to, that we should be listening to Indigenous people as we engage in our research. Here again, the Seminoles are warning us today that if we only look at Spanish, and I would say British too, records, if we don't listen to their own oral histories in which they recount that among their ancestors are Yamasees, Appalachians, Timucuas, and other indigenous Floridians, that we continue to sort of go down the pathway of depicting Florida as a widowed land in the 18th century when it wasn't. The Seminoles and Miccosukes today and the Muskogee Nation in Oklahoma, who are forcibly removed from the South, all claim indigenous Floridians among their ancestors. For the Seminoles and Miccosukes, they very much see themselves as the stewards of Florida's indigenous history. And that has relevance for them today as they continue to be typecast as recent arrivals to Florida, and that is used in an effort to try to undercut their sovereignty in the state, despite them being federally recognized, a particularly dangerous and precarious position to be in right now with the current administration, both at the state but especially the federal levels. So as I conclude, I'm also going to pitch some projects that are going on in Northeast Florida. There's a lot of exciting work actually going on Indigenous history right here in our region. At the University of North Florida, we have a couple of different projects we're already at the sort of final stages of completing. One is we have a remarkable Indigenous tour of Fort Caroline, the French fort established in 1564 in the center of Mocama homelands. With our own students, we've developed a digital tour of this, and that is the QR code. You can go on right now and you can visit and see what the Mocama side of the story is in this French and Mocama encounter. I've also been working really closely with the Cebuano group. We have a website where you can actually learn Timucua. So there's a phenomenal linguist at the University of Florida, Aaron Broadwell, who for over a decade has been reconstructing the Timucua language. We're also in the process of publishing a book, which will be a great reader for undergraduates to look at the language material that we have that comes very much out of the Franciscan encounter with Timucuas. And so it offers a translation of part of that and also some really good teaching materials. And then finally, we're at the beginning of a really exciting project at the University of North Florida where we are recasting the Theodore DeBry engravings of 16th century Mocamas and other Timucuas. If you don't know these engravings, you've probably seen them at any museum that you've gone to in the South that has early Indigenous people featured. These engravings were really the only lasting images we have of the 16th century of Indigenous people. There's also a comparable series by DeBry of the John White images from the Outer Banks. The ones from Florida, we don't have originals for. So we know that there's a lot that's invented in there. They're very caricatured. They're very inaccurate. They're very damaging to Indigenous people. And so we're partnering with Indigenous artists who are reimagining these. We have a seminal artist we've just hired, Alyssa Osceola. It's very exciting. She's a phenomenal artist. With our students, we created entirely new materials, research materials to help guide the artists. And all of this will be in the public domain. And we hope to sort of push these DeBrys out of museums and scholarship and to replace them with more accurate 16th century images of Indigenous people. So I want to conclude by thanking my partners and again thanking all of you for having me here and for listening to me talk a little bit about Indigenous Florida through the eyes of Bartram. Thank you.
All right. Thank